I'm from Dublin, Ireland. Today it's kind of overcast. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Ireland, but basically it's overcast a lot of the time. The talk today is an integral theory. There's five elements, but there's a little bit more in it today than just the 5 elements. I hope that I will get it all done in an hour, maybe be under an hour, maybe over an hour, but thereabouts. I hope that you'll be able to receive. It's a lot to receive in 1 hour, so just take in what you can take in, and if you can't take something in, maybe we can get to it in the questions and answers afterwards. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and just let me hold on. Slideshow. Start. Okay. So this is an introduction to integral theory. So integral theory is 5 elements. The first element, it's called AQUAL. So I'll just go back to that actually. See those letters there, AQAL, that's all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types. They're the 5 elements. So the first one is quadrants, and that's broken into perspectives and dimensions. So the perspectives are subjective, intersubjective, objective, interobjective, and that they have an inside and an outside, an individual and a collective. So the inside would be psychological. If you're in a meeting, right, you'd have psychological insights, which would be subjective, and you'd have cultural beliefs, which is intersubjective. Or you'd have behavioral observations, which would be objective, that'd be outside, and organizational dynamics, which is interobjective. So, you know, psychological insights would be something like, oh, I see that this is the case. Cultural beliefs would be that we believe the environment is something that is worth sustaining. That'd be like a value or a belief. Behavioral observations would be like, I see when you do this, this happens. And organizational dynamics could be something like, well, everything's flat and we're all equal. There's no hierarchy in our organization, and we all share the roles. So there's an example. So there are also dimensions. So interiors and exteriors. Dimensions are interiors and exteriors. So the interior of my being has subjectivity and intersubjectivity. That's intentionality and cultural is what they're called. And the exterior is behavioral and physiological. That's objective. And then the systems dynamics, and that's interobjective. So take, for example, like the one thing I haven't mentioned so far, like I gave examples of behavior there a minute ago, but physiology is also in the objective quadrant. That'd be like your heart rate or your blood pressure or things like that. So they also can be spoken about in pronouns. So, you know, all major languages have 3 core pronouns and perspectives. So it's I, we, it, and Wilber has extended it to its plural. So I is first person perspective. We is second person perspective plural. So a second person perspective is like I, first person perspective plural. So it's I, you, or we. If we have a common understanding, it's we. It is third person objective. So like looking at things from outside, things you can see, like if you look at your clothes that you're wearing, you can see them. They're evident to everybody. That's a third person perspective. And it's third person perspective plural. Well, that would be a situation where, you know, you see that the road traffic system works in a fluid manner at certain times, and it doesn't work at fluid manner at different times. The road traffic system would be an its perspective. And these could be broken down into what is known as the big 3. That's art, which is first person perspective, morals, which is second person perspective, and science, which is third person perspective. So the way it's written is I is in the upper left quadrant, and that's abbreviated to UL. We is in the lower left quadrant, that's abbreviated to LL, LL for lower left. And it is in the upper right quadrant, abbreviated to UR for upper right, and its is the lower right quadrant, LR for lower right. So this is what it looks like. This is what what it looks like. So if you look at this diagram, in the upper left, you have I, intentional, subjective, and you also have individual. And in the upper right, you have it, behavioral, objective, and it's exterior, but it's also in the individual. And then the we, cultural, is in the lower left, intersubjective is in the lower left, and that's collective. And it's social, interobjective in the lower right is also collective. So throughout history, there of philosophy and perspectives, there's been three major perspectives, which are the first person, second person, and third person. So the first person perspectives tend to be about aesthetics and consciousness, and famous philosophers like Plato would have written about the beautiful. Kant has a book called The Critique of Judgment. Habermas has the idea of truthfulness. And then second person perspectives tends to be about morals or culture. And Plato's concept of the good would fall here. Kant wrote a book called The Critique of Practical Judgment, which is about the good. And Habermas has a sense of rightness or intersubjective justness. So, and then there's the third person perspective, which is about science or nature. And you've got Plato's The True, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and Habermas's Truth. So integral theory holds that there is a process prevalent in some academic quarters that reduces the left-hand quadrants to the right-hand quadrants, thus reducing the interiors to the exteriors only. For example, instead of acknowledging, say, feelings of anguish, they describe them as brain states. So if you look at brain states, they're in the upper right quadrant. You can look at them on an MRI scan, but it doesn't actually show you what the actual feelings are. It might show you a brain state, but it doesn't actually show the feelings. If you actually ask the person what they're feeling, they might say, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling happy, or I'm feeling anguish. So integral theory holds that you cannot reduce one quadrant to another. For example, some systems theorists describe consciousness with flow charts and feedback loop, but completely misses the interior dimension of the felt sense of psychological dynamics. So then again, even if it's in the lower right quadrant, it's a systems perspective, but it's describing the interior workings of consciousness through feedback loops and flow charts, but it's not talking about how the actual consciousness is. What's the direct experience of the person? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What impulses do they have? What sensations do they have? So let's just have a look at this. If you're going to the shops, what are the four perspectives that you would take when you're going to the shops? So in the upper left subjective individual consciousness, you would be saying something like, I enjoy buying some groceries, but I worry about the cost. In the upper right objective individual behavior, you have neuronal activity in the brain, and you'd have bodily states. So you'd also be doing something. So you'd pick up a basket or get a trolley. So in the lower right, interobjective collective systems, where did the food come from? Is it local or was it shipped in? How is the price set? What ecological consequences are there to buying this product? And in the lower left, intersubjective cultural context, am I shopping in a farmer's market, a large chain store, an organic only reduced packaging store, a small independent retailer? And, if you're in these different stores, you might ask yourself, what meanings do we share? How how should we relate to each other? You know, like take for example, if you're in an organic only reduced packaging store, they'd actually want you to be friendly to them and they want you to take the time to talk. You know, but if you're in a large chain store, they may want you to hurry on because they want to serve the next customer and they may want you to be efficient. So it may be different depending on different contexts. So there's also two ways of looking at the quadrants. So one is quadrants and one is quadrivia. Quadrants are situated embodied perception, which is pretty much like the way I've just described people going to the store, somebody going to the store. They have four perspectives. They're looking at things from inside their own awareness, and their own awareness contains all these four perspectives of the quadrants. There's also quadrivia, which is four ways of seeing. So this example here is a person situated in the center of the four quadrants, and they have experiential phenomena going to the shops, behavioral phenomena going to the shops, cultural phenomena going to shops, and social systemic phenomena going to shops, which are described. However, you can also look at an object and take a perspective. So if you go back to these are actually the dimensions of your own being: the experiential phenomena, the behavioral phenomena, the cultural phenomena, and social systemic phenomena. However, you can actually look at something, an object, through the four quadrants as well. So one is looking as, which is the quadrants, and a quadrivia is looking at. So if you were looking at a dying fish in a lake, and you might, you know, have a self-identity as a fisherman, and you might be worried about the eutrophication in the lake because it's killing all the fish and you can't make a living out of it. Or you might be a farmer and you might have no concern about the lake really in relation to your economic world. You know, and then if you look at behavioral and physiological analysis in the upper right quadrant, you have what's actually causing the fish to die. So it's a chemical, just say that it's the chemical nitrate. So that's a chemical that's causing the fish to die. So, and then if you look at the ecological and social assessments, you know, you might say, if you take an environmental assessment, you might say, where's the nitrate coming from? Okay, the farmers are putting fertilizer on their fields. The rain is coming down. It's the fertilizer is flowing into the lake. It's causing the lake to be full of nitrates. The nitrates are causing eutrophication, and the fish are dying. So that's an ecological assessment. You could also have an economic assessment there, where you're actually saying something like, oh, well, how is this affecting tourism? How is this affecting business of the people on the lake? And then if you look at the people on the lake, what is their cultural worldview? You know, if it's a religious worldview, you might think that if they behave in the right way, that God will put things right and the lake will get better. Or if they have an economic worldview, like a financial capitalist worldview, they might say, I'd like the lake to be fixed because I want my business as a fisherman to continue. But if you're you know, and then they might have an ecological worldview. Is that like the lake is a beautiful place? I'd like it to remain beautiful. I love sitting here in the evenings watching the sun go down. It's really, I think, you know, the aesthetics of the world, environment and the biodiversity are worth preserving, and that would be an ecological worldview. So all of these things come to bear are perspectives you can look at on the lake. So when you look at all of these, take all of these different perspectives, there's not just one perspective on dying fish in the lake. There are multiple perspectives, and they're all can be viewed through the quadrants. So now I'm going to move on. So that's the quadrants. We'll take questions on the quadrants at the end of the talk, at the end of the hour. So there's also, as well as quadrants, there's lines, and lines are various developmental capacities. So if you just think of a talent you have, maybe you're intelligent and intellectual, or a great runner, or great at relating to people, or a very moral person with strong ethics and principles. Are you relatively poorly developed, averagely developed, or well developed in this area? you know, or you can also phrase the question by asking a double-edged question, like what am I good at and what am I bad at, you know? So maybe you're good at one thing and you're bad at another. So asking whether I am highly, averagely, or poorly developed in these areas is another way you can use lines. So if you go back there now, so if you're a great runner, your kinesmatics are very well developed. If you're intellectual, you might be cognitively very well developed. If you're great at relating to people, you might be emotionally very well developed. Or if you're a moral person with strong principles, you may be morally developed. You know, maybe there's an area that I excel in, and this is leading my development. So take, for example, I do art. So often I get my ideas of where I'm going in life and what is my next leading edge, my next natural step, through the ideas that are coming up for me when I'm generating ideas for my art. So this is a kind of something that leads my development. You know, and maybe there's an area I'm weak in or undeveloped, and this is holding me back or sabotaging my development in some way. So just imagine that you're always fighting with somebody, your siblings or your workmates. You know, you may have an emotional problem, and you may not actually. You may need to look at that, and that may be in the emotional line of development. Maybe there's some part of you that is less developed, or it may be your values. Maybe your values are different than those around you, and they're holding you back from actually excelling in a certain area like business. For example, various developmental capacities are sometimes called multiple intelligences. So an individual psychograph will be made up of, just for example, there's more to it than this, but cognitive, emotional, kinesthetic, interpersonal, moral, and self-identity. And then there's a sociograph as well, which is about societies and cultures. And that will have also have kinesthetic and interpersonal, artistic, cognitive, technological, physical longevity, and polyphasic. So that would look like this. So if you look at the lines, it's not like most people here are aware of spiral dynamics, and there's 8 levels in spiral dynamics as far as I know, unless it's changed recently. But this, you don't actually go to all the levels. You just use lines in a way to say that is it low, medium, or high. So if you look at this psychograph, the cognitive line is high, the emotional line is low, the kinesthetic line is high, the interpersonal line is average, the moral line is average, and the self-identity line is average. People in general, Keegan, so Wilber is informed by an awful lot of places, but one of the places that the idea of the cognitive line is about awareness. So you can't actually, you have to be aware of something before you can relate to it. So, I'm aware. So Keegan posited in the book, The Evolving Ego, that the cognitive line leads more than anything else because you have to be aware of something before you can relate to it. But and then you have to be able to relate to it again before you can actually take a moral stance in it. So people actually, so Wilber holds that the lines are relatively independent and that they relate to one another. So in a sense, the cognitive line would lead, and then once you have the cognitive, the emotional, and just that, kinesthetic is how do I do something? So, how do I do something, or what's my intention, can be like my impulse, my intention can also be there as well in some people's formulation of the line, because there's action involved in intention. Some people hold that, but so if I take the cognitive, emotional, kinesthetic, and I have those lines developed, then I can relate to something like, even dying fish in a lake. If I'm not aware of them, I'm not going to relate to them, or I'm not going to have an identity around fishing, or non-identity around fishing. I'm not going to take a moral stance on fishing. People formulate these things differently. Some people say that the self-identity line comes before interpersonal, and some people say that you need all of these lines together before you can have an identity. That's the psychograph. So that's just an example of different perspectives on the psychograph. If you look at the sociograph, there's the kinesthetic, the interpersonal, the artistic, the cognitive technological, the physical longevity, and polyphasic. So polyphasic is one you probably haven't heard of, but it's an example would be access to states. So, excuse me, if you take the Western world, with the state that we're allowed into and that is condoned is the rational state. But in other cultures, access to other states like irrational or non-rational states, like trance experiences in shamanism in Peru or something, that they're totally acceptable, you know. Whereas, so polyphasic is your culture open to many states, or is it open to just one state? Cognitive technological, take for example, you know, the reason why cognitive and technological would be put together would be because, you know, you start off with something like a spear, like take for example Lenski's, I'll go on to it again in a minute, but Lenski's theory of technological evolution would actually hold that we start off with as hunter-gatherers with spears and baskets, and then we move to horticultural people with a hoe, and then in agrarian culture we move on to using a plow, and so on like that. Artistic, you know, it could be, is it a pluralistic, is there many models of art, or is it just like one kind of realistic? So, like to say in Russia there was social realism was the only form of art that was acceptable, you know, during the Cold War. And so people that had more abstract stuff were kind of sidelined and marginalized. So that wasn't a very artistically open country. Whereas in the West, you could be realistic, you could be abstract, you could be you could use, like you had people like using found objects and stuff like that as well. So you could, and now you can do installations and you can do video work and photography, and it's a much more developed artistically country than Russia was during the Cold War. So here is an example of the lines putting into the 4 quadrants. So, you know, if you were to take something like emotional access, right? That's in the upper left, emotional access, your ability to access your own emotions and your self-awareness with your own emotions and your self-management of emotions. Well, they would show up in the upper left as like, I'm aware of what I'm feeling right now. But, you know, if you were to look at them from the upper right, that correlates with that, with the feeling you have, there would be a neurotransmitter on a brain scan or a brainwave pattern, you know. And if you were to think about it in a grammatical sentence in the lower right, it could be the words "I love you" or "I'm feeling anxious." And if you were to think about it in the lower left, you know, I could be feeling anxious. The linguistic meaning of feeling anxious could be different depending on different contexts. So in one, it might be because I'm going to work or because I'm going on a date or whatever later on in the day, you know. So there's all these different lines and different quadrants. So if you look in the upper left, they're cognitive, emotional, interpersonal skills, psychosexual expression, moral capacity, spiritual experience, self-identity dynamics. Actually, in Integral Psychology, the book by Wilber, he actually has about 100 lines, most of them in the upper left, that he's analyzed. And there's charts for them at the back of his book. Then, you know, in the upper right, you've got organic structures, neuronal systems, neurotransmitters, brainwave patterns, skeletal muscle growth, nutritional intake, kinesthetic capacity. And then, you know, in the lower right, to the forces of production, geopolitical structures, ecosystems, written legal codes, architectural styles, grammatical systems, evolutionary paths. And then in the lower left, you'd have the we space, we'd have worldviews, intersubjective dynamics, linguistic meaning, cultural values, background, cultural context, philosophical positions, and religious understandings. Now, this is just a snapshot. There actually are way more lines than this. This just these are just some examples. So I gave the example there of the emotion of love in the upper left correlates the brainwave pattern in the upper right, which correlates with the grammatical form of the sentence "I love you" in the lower right, but correlates with the cultural backgrounds that you are my sibling in the lower left. There's an example. Or you are my wife could be another example in the lower left. You know, lines develop through levels, and you're aware of levels through the spiral dynamics. But just to give an example of other lines, interiors have depth. So the left-hand quadrants are the interiors, just to remind you. So the upper left I space and the lower left we space are the interiors. So in the in the interiors you'd have something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that's one that everybody knows about. It's very popular. You learn it in business school. You learn it. Well, I don't know what you call. I think you call it high school. Some people in high school might learn it as well. So you start off with your survival needs, your security needs, your love and belonging needs, and when they're fulfilled, you move on to esteem needs, and when that's fulfilled, you move on to actualization needs, and when that is fulfilled, you move on to self-transcendence needs. Another example would be Kohlberg's level of moral development, which I'll go into in a minute. Exteriors have complexity. So that's the difference between the exteriors of the right-hand quadrants. They have complexity. So Marx's model of economic production, from primitive communism up to feudalism, up to capitalism, up to socialism, up to communism. And then you've got Lenchley's technological development, which I described a minute ago, up as far as agrarian, the plough. But you'd also have industrial, would be, say, like a computer. Or industrial would be like a tractor, and informational would be like a computer. So if you look at Kohlberg's moral line of development, and what I'm doing here now, just to point out what I'm doing here, is I'm actually giving you examples of lines, so you can have something to apply to. So in Kohlberg's moral line of development, there's the egocentric, I care about me; ethnocentric, I care about us or our group; and world-centric, I care about all of us as individuals. And then you can go even further in world-centric, but I care about all of us as groups. And in Lenchley's theory of social evolution that I went through, hunter-gatherers start with spears and baskets, pastoral and horticultural would have a hoe, agrarian would have a plough, industrial would have a tractor, and post-industrial would have computer systems. So levels are structures. That's one. So I'm moving on to levels now. So that's lines developed through levels. So what levels actually are structures. Each level is considered to be an altitude, and in that sense, it is deemed to be content-free structure that we translate horizontally. Levels can be compared to structures like centigrade or Fahrenheit. Both are ways to divide up measurements, and both work equally well. So integral theory uses colors, just like spiral dynamics, to designate structures of consciousness in a general and content-free way. They're actually slightly different than spiral dynamics, and there was a controversy because Ken used to use the spiral dynamics colors, but then he changed them to be more rainbow-like, as he calls it. So he goes from infrared to magenta to red to amber to orange to green to teal to turquoise to indigo to violet to ultraviolet and clear light. And that's a much wider range than just 8 levels. He uses more than that. So take, for example, amber would be blue in spiral dynamics and teal would be yellow in spiral dynamics, the structure. So there's an example of what it looks like. So if you look here, so what I'm trying to point out is that all of these structures are empty. in a sense that, so if you take, for example, the cognitive line, at red, it's pre-operational, but at the self-identity line, at red, it's self-protective. At the values line, it's egocentric. You know, and morals, it's called naive hedonism. In faith, in the faith line of development, it's called mythic literal, and the content of each line would be each red would be different depending on what line you're looking at. So it's the same. So take, for example, if you look at green, the pluralistic mind is metasystemic or systemic, or it's metasystemic, and that's the cognitive thing. But the actual self-identity in Lovinger, Kuckuck-Gruder is individualistic. That's sometimes called pluralistic because it's people have different emphasis, but it has a different content than pluralistic mind would have. If it's formed by somebody like Torbert, who's another person, he would have it as individualistic, and he would see it slightly different, you know. And then the values are relativistic, or what in sport dynamics is called green, and you know, and then the actual morals would be prior rights and social contract, and in fate it would be conjunctive. So conjunctive would be different. Conjunctive, the content of the fate line is different than the content of, say, the self-identity line. But so this is a way of showing, I'm trying to show you here that all of the levels are actually structures that are empty structures that can be used to measure something, like a ruler. A ruler, you can measure the tiles in your bathroom, or the floorboards, or the length of your table, but the actual inches and feet are actually, or if you're in Europe, it would be millimeters and centimeters and meters. They're actually empty. So, you know, the ruler is actually an empty structure. So that's what the colors symbolize for levels in Wilber's model. So levels can correlate. So an example would be a goal-driven executive in the upper left who has high blood pressure in the upper right may have a scientific and rational outlook on in the lower left, and may work in an industrial corporate organization in the lower right. All of these show up with the orange on the integral map, but the content in each quadrant is different. And levels can mismatch. Excuse me. If you are a sensitive self in the upper left who believes in pluralism in the lower left, and you work in a religious organization in the lower right that believes in a single true way in the lower left, then yourself and your worldview are at green and your organization is at amber, then your level of self and worldview are much higher than your organization. So your level of self and worldview are mismatched with the organization you're working for. So here's an example of levels in the in human beings. So you'll recognize some of these terms here. Those of you who study sport dynamics in the lower left: archaic, animistic, magical, power gods, mythic order, scientific, rational, pluralistic, holistic, and integral. Wilber, and it goes from pre-modern to modern to post-modern, and that's the evolution of the line. And integral would hold that it's postmodern in a sense. And Wilber mixes things up because he uses words like mythic order, and he uses words like holistic and integral, and he gets those words from Gebster, and he uses words like archaic and power gods, which he gets from Graves. So it's kind of a mixture there. If you look at the upper left, it starts the instinctual self, the magic self, the warrior self, the mythic self, the achiever self, the sensitive self, holistic self, integral self. And the idea is that one level builds on another level, that you don't actually transcend and dissociate, you transcend and include. in the upper right, then you go from atoms to molecules to cells and so on, or you go from brainstem to limbic system to cortex to neocortex, and then in the survival, then in the lower right, the things progress from foraging to up as far as informational, through survival clans, ethnic tribes, feudal empires, early nations, corporate states, value communities, holistic commons, and integral meshworks. A meshwork is kind of like that the whole thing is interpenetrating itself. So every single level interpenetrates with every other single level in an interpenetrating way, and they all co-rise to one time in all four quadrants. That's what I understand the integral meshwork to be. Yeah, so let me just go. So levels develop hierarchically. This means that each level is a whole in and of itself, but is part of a greater whole. In the subjective dimension, sensations are transcended by impulses, which are transcended by emotions, which are transcended by symbols, which are transcended by concepts, which are transcended by rules, and so on. So impulse transcends, but also includes sensation, and an emotion transcends and includes impulse and a sensation. So these are called holons because they're parts of greater wholes, but they're wholes in and of themselves. So holons are part wholes. And a holarchy is a type of hierarchy which liberates through development rather than dominates through rank. So the green postmodern worldview doesn't like hierarchies. It sees hierarchies as being dominating and suppressing, and it likes to have everything flat. But this isn't the dominating hierarchy where somebody in a business organization has more power over somebody to prevent them from climbing the ladder or getting what they want, or in the company. This is a hierarchy where you develop through levels, and the increasing level you develop through means you're more liberated and free and can take more perspectives. So each level transcends and includes limitations of the previous level, but also includes its healthy components. Healthy growth is to differentiate, transcend, and reintegrate. So unhealthy growth is to dissociate, repress, or to remain fused with the previous level. So take, for example, when you're at green, say, and you want to get to teal, you have to disidentify and differentiate yourself from green, and you can transcend it up to teal. And once you get to teal and are comfortable with teal, you can reintegrate green. And then you actually have a teal, green, orange, amber, and so on, all the way down, integrated being. Whereas unhealthy growth is if you are at, say, green, and you dissociate from green rather than differentiating from it, and you repress green, and then you transcend to teal, but you've dissociated from green. So green's bad. We hate green. Green's bad. Green's this, green's that, green's the other. Oh, you're so green. And all these kind of ad hominem type terms that dismiss people who are at green. So that's dissociation. That's not differentiating and reintegrating. Or you could, in process of development, you could remain fused with the previous level. So you might transcend to teal, but a part of you might be stuck in your value community. They can't kind of separate from your value community at green, because and the value community worldview, and it's said by the value community because you're fused with the level at green. So, and you're so fused with it that you can't actually be autonomous at teal. So that's levels. Now I'm going to go on to states. So before I go on to states, I'm just going to talk about bodies. So in Wilber's theory, there are three bodies. States of consciousness are held by these three bodies. So there's gross, subtle, and causal bodies. So we don't just have one body, we have three bodies. So states of consciousness do not hang in the air, disembodied and floating. They are supported by three separate bodies. So this is an example from the Integral Life Practice book. So if you, sorry, go back there. So if you look, the first body is the physical body. And these are just different practices you can do with the physical body. Like you can do physical exercise or aerobic training or strength training or resistance exercises, or you can have a nutritional practice with the body. And then you have a subtle body, and your subtle body comprises the energetic elements of your being. So breath, prana, life force, energy flow, and then there's things like subtle breath practice, or even channeling of archetypes, subtle deities in Buddhism would be an example, Tai Chi, or taking on yoga. Yoga is a mixture of physical and subtle, but you've got subtle energy practices in yoga, and same with Tai Chi. And then the causal body comprises the infinite field of your existence, openness, presence, spaciousness, and feeling to infinity. So this can be found in aspects of meditation or releasing to infinity. And there's a 3-body workout that the Integral community has that practices showing up in all 3 bodies. So the bodies actually hold the states in place. So I'm going to go on to all states now. So states are temporary occurrences that can last anywhere from a few minutes to hours to days to even weeks or months or years. They tend to be incompatible with one another. So you can't be drunk and sober at the one time, and you can't have a blizzard and a heat wave in the same place in the one day. So there's different dimensions, there's different states. So in the upper left, there's natural states like waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Every 24 hours, we wake, we dream, and we go into deep, dreamless sleep. There's also altered states, externally induced, like drugs, trauma, near death could induce an altered state, or you can internally induce them through meditation, flow, lucid dreaming, and you're actively creating these internally. Then in the upper right, there's brain states like alpha, beta, theta, delta, hormonal states like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, behavioral states like crying, smiling, or there's also physical states like water goes from ice, from solid to liquid to gas in the form of ice to water to steam. And in the lower left, group states. So you got mob mentality, mass hysteria, or you could be at a concert or a baseball match and everybody's in great form or high on the match in a sense. You got intersubjective states. You got somatic bonding or shared resonance, like between a mother and her child. Then you got religious states like shared ecstasy, bliss, communal experience of the divine. In the lower right, you've got weather states like a heat wave or a blizzard. Or you got economic states like bear or bull market, bubble, boom, recession. And then you got ecological states like entropy, increased disorder, or eutrophy, being well nourished. So that's an example there. That's how it looks in the 4 quadrants when we put them all together. So there we go. So state shift. We could be in great form because of some good news, we got when we were in work, and then we're driving, or when we got in the morning before we went to work, and then we're driving to work, we could become irritable because a guy crosses in front of us on the motorway or the highway, I think you call it. Or we could feel anxious about giving a talk and shift to feeling hungry and wondering what we're going to eat. So we can use states to design things like workshops. So, for example, I know this format is the guest speaker's format, but your normal speaker's format is that is you break out into from the large group into smaller group, and this prevents people from getting bored. Or at the end of this hour, we might take a bio break for 2 or 3 minutes so people can get a drink of water or go to the toilet. And you might feel restless in your chair after a long time. So you can design seminars and workshops all based around the idea of how states work. So that's states. So the next thing is types, and types are various patterns. They're the variety of styles that arise in various domains and occur irrespective of developmental level. So in the upper left, subjective, you got personality types like the Kiersey-Bates model, the Enneagram, Myers-Briggs model, or you have the Pearson-Meyer archetype indicator, and you've got gender types like masculine and feminine. In the upper right, you got blood types like A, B, B, O, and you got body types like ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph. In the lower right, you got inter-objective systems, biome types, steppe, tundra, islands, and regime types like communist, democracy, dictatorship, monarchy, republic. In the lower left, you intersubjective cultural contexts like religious systems, monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, panentheism, kinship systems, Eskimo, Hawaiian, Sudanese. So that's kind of what it looks like when we put them all together. There's a snapshot of the 4 quadrants. So I'm going to just talk about masculine and feminine to give you an example of a type and how it works. So people dispute this because it's construct and they don't sometimes like the way it's formed, but this is the way Wilber kind of tends to form the masculine and feminine. So masculine tends to be orientated towards autonomy, justice, and rights. The feminine tends to be orientated towards relationship, care, and responsibility. Masculine tends to follow rules. Feminine tends to follow connections. Masculine likes to look, and feminine likes to touch. Masculine tends towards individualism. Feminine tends towards relationship. So there's an example. The classic example is a baseball game. There's a clash of rules and feelings. So young boy's response, 3 strikes and you're out. Even if you cry, that is the rule. A girl's response is, he's upset. Give him another go. You know, boys hurt feelings in order to obey the rules. Girls break the rules in order to save feelings. There's developmental integration happens between masculine and feminine at the higher levels. So as Kohlberg, as I talked about earlier on, has the idea of expanding a sense of justice. Carol Gilligan is another researcher in the morals, and she maintains that the feminine development of morals is different than justice. It's more focused around care. She hypothesized that, and she basically so if you take, for example, the masculine will go through justice for me, justice for us, justice for all of us. The feminine would go for care for me, care for us, care for all of us. And at the mature level, it's not either masculine or feminine, but it's both masculine and feminine, both justice and both care. So integration means interpenetration of masculine and feminine. So before I go any further, I'll just one more thing to say on this. So take, for example, as well as justice, you'd have care. So justice tends to be rules, rights, and care tends to be responsibility. So an example, in some teaching of some organizations, it's about rights and responsibility. Tony Blair was this politician years ago in England, and he used to always talk about rights and responsibilities, which is the integration of justice and care. So justice will give you right, and responsibility will take responsibility for making sure that you actually have your rights met. So I talked about quadrants earlier on, but they're actually, quadrants is a little bit more complicated than just the 4 quadrants. There actually is a complexification of the quadrants known as zones. And those of you who actually do know something of integral theory, you might know this or you might not, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it now. So zones are different ways of knowing. Each quadrant has an inside part of it and an outside part of it. Inside is studying from a first-person perspective, like direct experience, and outside is studying it from a third perspective, like objectively. So it's called integral methodological pluralism. That's a big word. And there's 8 methodologies, or eight perspectives. Sorry, that shouldn't say. It looks like there are methodologies, but there's more than one methodology in each perspective. So there's really 8 perspectives: structuralism, phenomenology, empiricism, autopoiesis, hermeneutics, ethnomethodology, social autopoiesis, and systems theory. That might be a lot to swallow, but I'll just show you. I'll go through them now. So structuralism is an outside methodology, and phenomenology is an inside methodology. So if you look at this chart, we have the 4 quadrants. So in the upper left, you've got structuralism, phenomenology. So phenomenology would be your direct experience of life. So when you're meditating, whatever you experience when you're meditating, that is your direct experience. But if you were to write a journal about your meditation, and you've tracked your journal over months and years, you would see how you developed through different structures or through different stages of your meditation practice. And that would be a third person perspective. So that's the outside of the interior quadrant. And empiricism in the exterior quadrant, the upper right, empiricism is like what you can see, like so, and this is extended to what you can see with the senses. This is extended through things like telescopes and microscopes, so you can see the stars more clearly through a telescope, and you can be more accurately discern what's there, or X-ray charts and things like that, or microscopes. You can see microbes under microscopes, and that's extending the senses. The interior of the inside of the exterior is called autopoiesis. And I know it says cognitive sciences there, but an example of autopoiesis is that our cells change completely 100% every 7 years. And yet the form of who we are stays the same. So even though all my cells are different, I still look like Joey. The form of Joey is still Joey. So that's autopoiesis. It's the self-organizing principle in nature. It's in humans, it's in animals. It's in nature. So you can take this and you can apply it to social autopoiesis. So what's the organizing principle of society? Or an organization. So if you have a restaurant, for example, and there's a couple come to the actual the reception and ask, do you have a table for 2 to eat in the restaurant? And the maitre d' takes it to the seat, and the seat has a number, and then the waitress comes and she takes your order and she writes the number of the table on the billing ticket. Then she takes the billing ticket and she gives it into the kitchen, and and with the order on it, and the chef cooks the meal and then puts the billing ticket back up, and the meal beside it. So the waitress comes, she looks at the billing ticket, she looks for the plates that are there, she chooses the meal that matches the billing ticket, and she brings it to the table. And then the couple, when they're finished, they take the billing ticket and they bring it to the cashier, and the cashier looks at the billing ticket and sees how much it costs, see what they had, thoughts of what they have, and then charges them. So that's a billing system. So the social autopoietic self-organization principle is around a ticket billing system. And then systems theory will be an external thing, like if you have heat coming into your house through, if you're heating up your house and your walls are porous, then the actual air will go out of your house and the heat will go out much quicker than if you actually have insulation. So if you improve your insulation, then the hot air will stay in the house longer, and that's because or if you increase the actual temperature in the room by a regulation of the dial, to a higher temperature, then the heat will go out of the room at a slower rate. That's a feedback loop, and that's a systems theory. So if you reduce the temperature, then the heat goes out of the room quicker. So the feedback is that at such and such a temperature, the optimum conservation of the heat in the room happens. And then if you look at zone 3 in the lower left, you've got hermeneutics. So that's basically, what do we value? So if you're doing a research project and you ask a community, a focus group, you know, you ask the first person what do they value, and you write it down, and then you ask the second person what they value, and you write it down, and you ask maybe multiple focus groups what they value, and just say imagine it's an environmental thesis you're doing, and then you actually are an environmental research, and you realize, well, there's certain qualitative capacities that these people actually have, are qualitative values that these people have. So they value something like local or resilient, or they value sustainability or organic food. And gradually, when you actually investigate the environmental community, you realize that there are certain things that they value, and that's hermeneutics, in the sense of you know, if 3 or 4 people value something, then a group values something, and then there's a value, then the values, the amount of values in the group increases. And methodology, the last one now, is an outside view of the community. So it's how you behave. So take, for example, if you're in a conservative amber or what you call blue society, you might actually go to a conference and you have to sign in, and you have to wear a badge with a label, and you have to be there at a certain time. Whereas if you and you know, you greet each other by having conversations over tea or coffee when you get there. Whereas if you're in a business company, a business conference, you might actually shake hands, and you might status jostle and say, you know, I just got this great promotion, and I've got a bigger package, and I've got a company car, and you'd be status jostling, and that's a different way of relating then, you know. And then if you're in a community garden that's environmentally centered, you might actually hug each other, and instead of wearing a suit, you might wear a colorful jumper, and you know, you might be all concerned about what's happening in people's lives, and you might spend time talking to them a lot more about interior aspects of their lives. So there's an example of a methodology. In different places, you behave in a different appropriate way. So integral methodological pluralism, you consult multiple perspectives and methods impartially. Oh yeah, there's 3 different aspects to integral methodological pluralism, and I'll finish with this because the hour is up. Inclusion. So there's constant multiple perspectives and methods impartially. You consult multiple perspectives impartially. Enfoldment is prioritize the importance of finding things generated from these perspectives, and enactment is recognized that phenomena are disclosed to their subjects through their activity known to it. So inclusion, you know, the 8 zones is basically an example of inclusion. You include all those perspectives in your research. Enfoldment means that if you actually have subjects that show up at amber and orange, well, amber is enfolded in orange. Orange transcends and includes amber, but green is outside it. So you don't prioritize green because it's outside your sphere of concern. You prioritize orange and amber, and maybe even red and stages below that, because they're enfolded. So to transcend and include model is actually the enfoldment process. And enactment is recognized that phenomena are disclosed to their subjects through their activity of knowing it. So Wilber has this idea of epistemology, methodology, and ontology. So if you look at something, you're looking at it through a methodology, and you actually have a theory of knowledge about it. So your knowledge is looking through a method, and it is finding, it is seeing an object. So take, for example, empiricism, looking through a microscope, you see microbes, see bacteria.